This is a homily for Passion or Palm Sunday. The Gospel for the commemoration of the Lord's entrance into Jerusalem comes from the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 19 verses 28 to 40. The Gospel for this Sunday is the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke, chapter 22 verse 14 to chapter 23 verse 56. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. The events that we commemorate today mark the beginning of Holy Week. This is the final week in the life of Jesus. It begins with Jesus approaching Jerusalem on the day that we traditionally call Palm or Passion Sunday, and it concludes with his resurrection from the dead on Easter Sunday. Keep in mind that Jesus and his disciples have come to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Passover was one of 3 pilgrimage festivals. The other 2 are Pentecost, or Shavuot in Hebrew, and Tabernacles or Booths, or Sukkot in Hebrew. Adult Israelite men were required to observe these 3 pilgrimage festivals. We read in the book of Exodus, 3 times a year you will hold a festival in my honour. 3 times a year all your menfolk will appear before the Lord Yahweh. If because of distance they were unable to travel 3 times in the year, they were obligated to observe at least the festival of Passover. Even Jews who lived in the diaspora looked upon Jerusalem as their mother city and endeavoured to make the pilgrimage at least once in their lives. Passover is celebrated on the 15th to the 22nd day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Since the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, the date of Passover will vary from one year to another. In 2025, Passover will be celebrated from April the 12th until April the 20th. Determining the chronology of the last week of Jesus is complicated, but scholars have tentatively dated the death of Jesus as Friday, April the 7th, 30 AD. This means that Palm Sunday fell on April the 2nd, 30 AD. The journey to Jerusalem, the longest section of Luke's Gospel, concludes with Jesus in Jericho. He then begins the steep ascent to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is about 785 metres above sea level, and Jericho is 252 metres below sea level. It is in fact the lowest city on earth. In Hebrew, the 3 pilgrimage festivals were referred to as Aliyah, which means going up. As you can see from this illustration, the final ascent from Jericho to Jerusalem was indeed a going up. Here you can see an old photo of the ancient Roman road between Jerusalem and Jericho. It was approximately 29 kilometres or 18 miles in length. So over a distance of about 29 kilometres, Jesus and his disciples will have made a steep ascent of over 1 kilometre. Pope Benedict makes an interesting observation about this ascent. He says, to begin with, it is an ascent in a geographical sense. The ultimate goal of Jesus' ascent is his self-offering on the cross. The ascent into God's presence leads via the cross. Having made the ascent, Jesus and his disciples draw near to Jerusalem. They are at Bethphage and Bethany, 2 villages close to the Mount of Olives that lie on the way from Jericho to Jerusalem. although one would arrive in Bethany before Bethphage. Jesus tells two of his disciples, "Go to the village opposite." Since Bethany will serve as Jesus' home base at this time, the village facing them is most likely Bethphage. The name of the village is Aramaic, and it means house of figs. In the Second Temple period, Bethphage marked the eastern confines of Jerusalem. In the Talmud, outside the wall of Bethphage meant outside Jerusalem. The two disciples are told to go to Bethphage, where they will find a tethered colt that no one has yet ridden. They are to untie it and bring it. If anyone asks, "Why are you untying it?" they are to reply, "The master needs it." They do as they are instructed and bring the colt to Jesus. They throw their clothes on its back and Jesus mounts it. Jesus then heads downwards from the Mount of Olives towards Jerusalem. Now we traditionally call today Palm Sunday, but let's have a closer look at what the Gospels actually tell us about what happens on the road from Bethphage to Jerusalem. Mark tells us that many spread their garments on the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields. So we have garments and leafy branches being placed on the road ahead of Jesus, almost like a carpet. Matthew tells us that most of the crowd spread their garments on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. So again, we have garments and branches spread on the road. Luke tells us that people spread their garments on the road. I guess that means that if we had only the Gospel of St. Luke, we wouldn't be calling today Palm Sunday, it would be Garment Sunday. It's only John's Gospel that tells us that people took branches of palm and went out to meet Jesus. John's Gospel doesn't mention garments, only palm branches. I don't think that this is an incidental detail. John's Gospel is making an important point by alluding to palm branches. What do they signify? To answer that question, look at this coin. There are palm branches on both sides of the coin. In fact, palm fronds appear on coins minted in Israel from 140 BC until 70 AD, and they also bear the inscription, "For the liberation of Israel." This is a quarter shekel coin that comes from the time of the Jewish War, which raged between 66 and 70 AD. It was therefore minted after the death of Jesus, but it is similar to coins in circulation during Jesus' lifetime. But once again, what is the significance of palm branches? For most of the 1,000 years between the time of King David and the time of Jesus, the Jewish people had been dominated by one superpower after another. In the 8th century BC, it was the Assyrians. Assyria wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah became a vassal state. In the 6th century BC, Babylon conquered the Assyrians, but Judah foolishly tried to resist the might of Babylon. Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, and thousands of Jews were taken into exile in Babylon. But the Persians conquered Babylon, and those Jews exiled in Babylon were given the freedom to return home if they wished. The destroyed temple was rebuilt, but the Jewish people remained under the rule of Persia. Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, and following his death in 323 BC, 4 empires emerged from the vast area once under Alexander's control. Finally, between 64 and 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey established Roman rule throughout Syria and Palestine. Let's zoom in on the period between Alexander's death and the beginning of Roman rule, the period from the 4th to the 1st century. Alexander had not appointed a successor, and his 7 ruling generals began to quarrel among themselves. The 4 generals who survived this period of rivalry and intrigue were Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Antigones. They laid the foundations for 4 great empires that emerged from the vast areas that Alexander had conquered. The most important of these, as far as the history of Palestine is concerned, were Ptolemy, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty based in Egypt, and Seleucus, who founded the Seleucid dynasty based in Syria. In 320 BC, Ptolemy took control of Palestine, and during the following 122 years the Jews were governed by a succession of their own high priests, subject to their overlords in Egypt. On the whole, the Ptolemies were mild rulers and did not attempt to interfere with the religious beliefs and practices of the Jews. All of that changed in 198 BC, when the ruler of the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus III, wrested Palestine from Egyptian control and annexed it to Syria. Life for the Jews now became very different and extremely difficult. The Seleucids were champions of Greek culture throughout their dominions and encouraged the use of the Greek language and the adoption of Greek customs. The situation took a turn for the worse when Antiochus IV Epiphanes became the ruler of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BC. New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger explains what happened next. In the succession of the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus Epiphanes became ruler in 175 BC. Although he himself delighted in the epithet Epiphanes, which means the manifest God, his victims called him Antiochus Epimanes, Antiochus the Insane. How appropriate the nickname was may be seen from the following. After an unsuccessful attempt in 169 BC to conquer Egypt, Antiochus returned through Palestine in a spirit of wild vindictiveness. Deprived of the prize that he had coveted, Antiochus treated the city of Jerusalem as though it had been the cause of his defeat. Gaining possession of the city by treachery, he sacked and burned it, plundered the temple, and massacred many citizens. Antiochus determined once and for all either to convert or exterminate those whose devotion to the laws of Moses seemed to imply disloyalty to Syria. The observance of the Sabbath, the rite of circumcision, and the possession of a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures were made crimes punishable by death. Jewish worship was abolished, and pagan altars were erected in many of the cities of Judea. The royal edicts were enforced with the utmost cruelty, and for the first time in history we have reliable and detailed records of widespread and bitter religious persecution. The climax of desecrating sacrilege came when, in December 167, a sow was sacrificed on the great altar of burnt offerings in the temple area. The Jews rose up in rebellion under the leadership of Judas the Maccabee. The word Maccabee means hammer, and that's what Judas did. He hammered the enemies of the Jewish people between 166 and 164 BC. Judas drove all the Seleucids out of the area around Jerusalem. The temple, which had been desecrated, was rededicated in 164 BC, an event that Jews still celebrate to this day, the feast of Hanukkah, or purification. The Seleucids retaliated, but the Jews, led by Simon, a brother of Judas, finally took possession of Jerusalem in 142 BC. A golden age of peace and prosperity came to pass under Simon's rule. Listen to this account from the first book of Maccabees of what happens as the victorious Jews enter their holy city. The Jews entered the citadel at Jerusalem with praise and palm branches, and with harps and cymbals and stringed instruments, and with hymns and songs, because a great enemy had been crushed and removed from Israel. Note the use of palm branches, symbols of a great victory. So palm branches had become a symbol for the liberation of Israel. In the century prior to the birth of Jesus, the Jews, now under the power of imperial Rome, longed for a king like King David of old, or like the Maccabean brothers Judas and Simon. They wanted an anointed one, a Messiah who would destroy unrighteous rulers and purge Jerusalem from Gentiles. These sentiments are expressed quite openly in the so-called Psalms of Solomon. The Psalms of Solomon were not written by Solomon, the son of David, nor are they part of sacred scripture. They were written sometime in the 1st century BC, quite possibly when Pompey had captured Jerusalem. Listen to these verses. Raise up for them their king, the son of David, to destroy the unrighteous rulers, to purge Jerusalem from Gentiles. He will have Gentile nations serving under his yoke. He will be a righteous king, the Lord Messiah. The crowd welcomes Jesus with palms, a symbol of Maccabean nationalism. They're hoping that Jesus is the one they have been waiting for, a new David, another Maccabean warrior. Here, they hoped, is the one who will overthrow the might of imperial Rome. As Jesus passes by, the people acclaim, "Blessed is he who is coming as king in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heavens." The people's acclamation evokes Psalm 118 verse 26. This is one of the Hallel Psalms, or Psalms of Praise, which were sung on the occasion of Israel's great national festivals of Tabernacles and Passover. New Testament scholar Richard Hayes tells us that both of these festivals were associated with Israel's national liberation from bondage in Egypt, and therefore also, in the 1st century context, linked with the hope of a future liberation from Roman rule and the coming of a new king. Luke, more clearly than in Mark or Matthew, makes this royal hope fully explicit in his account of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Only Luke here adds the king as an explanatory gloss on the coming one. Jesus knows what the people are thinking. By way of response, he doesn't approach the holy city in a chariot or riding a war horse. Instead, he rides upon a young colt. That is his powerful but silent reply to what the people are hoping for by waving their palm branches. Pope Benedict offers this reflection. This passage announces a poor king, a king whose rule does not depend on political and military might. His inmost being is humility and meekness. In this, he is the exact opposite of the great kings of the world, and a vivid illustration is the fact that he rides on an ass, the mount of the poor, the counter-image of the chariot that he rejects. Jesus is proclaiming the kingdom of God, and he has made it clear that this kingdom will be established by means of rejection, death, and resurrection in the city of David. The theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar writes this: Jesus is not interested in setting up a new kingdom of political power, as envisaged by the Israel of old, that is, one that would dominate the other nations of the earth, but a kingdom in which the poor and humiliated of this earth, whom Jesus called blessed, would finally share in those goods to which they are entitled. Jesus is indeed the true king, but not the king expected by the crowds who welcome him into Jerusalem with palm branches and a royal acclamation. He is a king whose rule does not depend on political and military might. Jesus will set his people free, but not freedom from foreign invaders, like the Maccabees had achieved over a century earlier. Jesus will win a far greater victory than the Maccabees, and a victory over a far more powerful and insidious foe. But it will not be a victory won by military might. On the Friday of this week, Jesus will be lifted up on the cross. His victorious death on the cross will set us free from the powers of sin and death. Von Balthasar again. Through the cross, and only through the cross, the gates of the kingdom will be opened. Only through the cross will the sharp swords in the hearts of men and women be beaten into ploughshares, and the wickedly designed spears of their plans and ambitions be made into pruning hooks in the service of a fruitful harvest. Despite a number of discrepancies, the four evangelists agree about the main events of the Passion narrative. Following a final meal with his disciples, Jesus is arrested and put on trial. Peter denies knowing Jesus. Jesus is crucified, and his body is placed in a tomb. However, each of the evangelists tells the story from his own perspective. And since this is the year of St. Luke, let us turn to an important emphasis that we find in Luke's Gospel. I've suggested on many occasions before that the key to understanding the distinctive perspective of each of the four evangelists is to look at the episode that they place at the beginning of the public ministry of Jesus. That event functions like a lens through which to read the Gospel. In Luke's case, it is Jesus' return to Nazareth. Jesus reminds the people of Nazareth of God's graciousness to two people who were not Jewish, stories told in the first book and second book of Kings. Firstly, during a time of severe famine, God sends the prophet Elijah to a widow in Zarephath, a Sidonian town. The widow was a Gentile, not an Israelite, living in a Phoenician town on the Mediterranean coast between Tyre and Sidon. Elijah assures the widow, who is on the verge of starvation, that her supply of flour and oil will not run out until the drought ends. Jesus then reminds the people of a story in which the prophet Elisha heals a Syrian leper by the name of Naaman. Naaman was the commander of the army of Syria. Jesus then says, "In truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's day, when heaven remained shut for 3 years and 6 months, and great famine raged throughout the land. But Elijah was not sent to any one of these, but only to a widow at Zarephath, a town in Sidonia. And there were many lepers in Israel in the prophet Elisha's time, but none of these was cured, only Naaman the Syrian." The townsfolk of Nazareth find this intolerable, and their mood turns ugly. They hustled him out of the town and took him up to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, intending to throw him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and walked away. One of the key points in this story is this: God's graciousness to two people who were not Jewish. This heralds a key theme of Luke's Gospel. Jesus welcomes the outsider. He is the embodiment of God's hospitality. When the tax collectors and sinners were all seeking the company of Jesus, the scribes and Pharisees complain, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Let's now fast forward to the scene of the crucifixion. All four evangelists tell us that Jesus was crucified between two others. But who are these two other men? John's Gospel simply refers to them as two others. Mark refers to them as two bandits. Bandits is a translation of the Greek word lestes. A few verses later, Mark again refers to them, but this time as those who were crucified with him. Matthew's Gospel refers to them as two bandits. Again, the Greek word used is lestes. A few verses later, Matthew again refers to them as bandits. Again, the same Greek word, lestes. This term, lestes, refers to a person who engages in robbery or banditry, often with violence or threat. In the New Testament, it is used to describe individuals who steal through force or intimidation, distinguishing them from common thieves, kleptes, who may act more covertly. It could also be translated as revolutionary or insurrectionist. The Roman authorities dealt harshly with such criminals, often sentencing them to crucifixion, a punishment reserved for the most serious offences. This context helps explain why lestes is used in the New Testament to describe those crucified alongside Jesus. Luke, however, doesn't use the word lestes. The New Revised Standard Version has criminals in Luke's Gospel. In chapter 28, verse 32, Luke uses the word kakurgos. A few verses later, he again uses the same word kakurgos. The term kakurgos comes from kakos, meaning bad or evil, and ergon, meaning work or deed. A literal translation would be malefactor or a doer of evil. It is used in the New Testament to describe individuals who engage in evil deeds or criminal activities. It conveys the idea of someone who is actively involved in wrongdoing, often in a legal or moral sense. The word is typically used to denote those who are guilty of serious offences, deserving of punishment. Punishment could include imprisonment, fines, or even execution. Luke's use of the word kakurgos emphasizes that the two men are guilty of having done something bad or evil. The same could also be said of the word lestes. However, lestes can also be used of someone who is a revolutionary or insurrectionist. Some Jews would regard such a person as a hero rather than as a bandit. Luke doesn't want any confusion. These two men are guilty of wrongdoing. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, the two bandits crucified with Jesus revile him. In Luke's Gospel alone, only one of those crucified alongside Jesus derides him. "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The other criminal, however, says, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." He then turns to Jesus and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." In Luke's Gospel, the very last words that Jesus speaks to another human being before he dies are addressed to this outsider dying alongside him. "This day you will be with me in paradise." New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne reminds us that the essence of salvation is not to be saved from physical death, but to be with Jesus, to accompany him on the exodus to the Father now underway. This man's conversion of heart and faith in Jesus has readied him for this journey. This climactic moment in the Gospel provides a point of insertion for all readers prepared to take a similar path.